Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. It is an honor and my genuine pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Her Excellency Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. I have known Dr. Ashrawi for... Now there's a man who also knows Dr. Ashrawi. I have known Dr. Ashrawi for many years, some of them spent at the negotiating table. She is, of course, an eminent Palestinian legislator, activist, and scholar. She was a member of the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991 and a Palestinian spokesperson from 1991 until 1993. Dr. Ashrawi was the Palestinian Minister of Higher Education and Research from 1996 through 1998, and in 2006, she was elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council on the Third Way Party ticket. And last but not least, our speaker is the Baker Institute's Diana Tamari Sabbagh Fellow in Middle Eastern Studies, and we're very happy that she is with us at the Baker Institute. Hanan Ashrawi founded and serves on the executive committees of the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy, which with the acronym MIFTA, and the National Coalition for Accountability and Integrity, AMAN, and is on the advisory board of several other international organizations. She is the recipient of numerous international honors and distinctions. In addition, Hanan has written many books, articles, poems, and short stories on Palestinian politics, culture, and literature. Her book, This Side of Peace, Simon & Schuster, published in 1995, received international acclaim. You'll notice in your program notes that Hanan got her doctorate in medieval and comparative literature from the University of Virginia, which I've always claimed is what really got her expertise in dealing with Middle East politics. Medieval, Middle East, there's something there. I came to know Hanan very well when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs between 1991 and 1993, and Secretary James A. Baker III worked very closely with Hanan over the course of many of his trips to the Middle East. In his 1995 book, The Politics of Diplomacy, Secretary Baker wrote of Hanan that tough, proud, courageous, and occasionally militant, she was nonetheless extraordinarily articulate and determined in arguing her brief. Instinctively, I liked her. Ultimately, she became an eloquent public spokesman for the Palestinians, end quote. In my own book, Danger and Opportunity, I recount how upon my departure as U.S. Ambassador to Israel in 1994, the American Consul General in Jerusalem hosted a farewell dinner with the Palestinian leaders who resided in the West Bank and Gaza. These leaders who Hanan Ashrawi truly exemplifies were obviously loyal to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and its chairman, Yasser Arafat. But yet, they also had a tradition of promoting democratic rule and not the authoritarian model that exists in much of the Arab world. During the dinner, I commented that I had always felt that the Palestinians were in a very good position to build a democratic society and to demonstrate respect for human rights. Given their history and unique historical experience, they had and still have the opportunity to build a Palestinian society based on democratic principles that, if successful, would have a major impact in the Arab world. Hanan is without question a passionate advocate for the Palestinian people, and you'll hear her tonight. She's going to speak on peace in the Middle East, lessons learned, and new directions. She is an equally strong supporter of democracy and human rights, as I mentioned, in the Middle East and the Palestinian territories. Hanan Ashrawi represents the real hope, in my eyes, of an independent, self-governing, and prosperous Palestinian state. We are happy that you're with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in inviting Hanan Ashrawi to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was slightly embarrassing and very humbling. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I thank you for coming this evening. It's great to see so many enthusiastic faces. And being at Rice University, and particularly at the Baker Institute, is really a pleasure, because I can't think of a more appropriate place to be to discuss the lessons of the past, so to speak, and to look forward to the future than this place, because Ed Georgian, Ambassador Georgian, and Secretary Baker really engaged in making history, in trying to make peace. So far, we still haven't seen the results of that engagement, but at least they were in the business of making history. And so I'm glad to be here. And it took a few years to get me here, but I'm finally here. And I would like to thank all the people involved at the Baker Institute. I started writing down names, and then I found out they were all really very involved and very helpful, the administrators and staff. So I think you have a very good team, as well as the fellows at the Baker Institute. And I wish I came with good news, actually. I just saw my cousin after years of separation, and he said, "How are things at home?" And I said, "I wish I was the bearer of good news." I'm not, but I'm realistic, and I'm going to be honest and candid, and quite often blunt, as Ed said. So we owe ourselves the truth, and we have to speak out on several issues. And we chose this topic not just as an indulgence in hindsight or as a diagnostic exercise only, but it really is a genuine imperative that we do assess candidly and honestly in order to try to chart a course ahead for the future, because heaven knows we are in deep trouble at present. From the beginning, there were glaring, almost blinding flaws and shortcomings that were allowed to persist and to undermine the whole endeavor of peacemaking. Now, I'm going to try to stay away from peace process for the future, but we will talk about what went wrong with the process. So the endeavor was at least an initiative to try to bring about peace in the Middle East, starting with the Palestinians and Israelis. And from now on, I'll talk about Palestine and Israel, because we were always the adjective, we were the Palestinians, the IAN, and Israel. So we were a people rather than a state, always. And now we're trying to shift from that misnomer. Now, that's why I said the first problem with that initiative was the fact that it incorporated the asymmetry of power, the imbalance between occupier and occupied. I remember from the beginning we asked always for accountability for Israel as an occupying power and for protection for the Palestinians as people under occupation, which of course we never got. At one point I even told Secretary Baker that what he's asking us to do was illegal. This was after months and months of negotiations and really Byzantine politics. And he said, "What do you mean it's illegal?" I said, "Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, people under occupation cannot be made to sign an agreement with their occupiers, because that means we are signing under duress." And part of their requirements was that the PLO was not there and that we were the people who were not PLO who were supposed to negotiate and sign. So at that point I said, after all is said and done, we cannot sign, which ultimately worked out because they signed with the PLO, and they signed at a point in which they felt that the institution itself is what is to be recognized rather than the nation, rather than national rights and self-determination and the Palestinian people as a whole. But anyway, we were the non-delegation at that point. We were the weaker. And there were no curbs in that asymmetry of power on Israeli behavior, with one exception. The one exception which the US took a decision to really play an effective role to curb Israeli behavior was the loan guarantees. It was at one point where the 10 billion loan guarantees were made conditional upon not spending that money on settlements in the West Bank. That was the only time there was conditionality on Israel. And yet even those were not implemented because of a fungibility of funds, and Israel found ways around this. But at least that was the one time in which there was any kind of curb. And ever since then we haven't seen that yet. Actually, just before this last administration left, they made sure that they signed the $10 billion for Israeli security, even under the current economic conditions. And they made sure also that they signed agreements on, I remember Tzipi Livni and Kandi Rice signed an agreement on sharing of intelligence information in order to check the weapons coming into Palestine, Israel, all the way to Iran, from Iran and all the way through the high seas. So this was never repeated. So unilateralism became the name of the game, and we saw Israel building settlements, expropriating more land, annexing Jerusalem, expelling Palestinians from Jerusalem, expropriating IDs and building the wall. And the wall is built on Palestinian land, by the way. We call it the wall of separation and annexation. It's not built on the lines, on the 67 lines. Many people say, well, what's wrong with that? You can have a border. But it's built on Palestinian land. And therefore, it is a wall that annexes Palestinian land to Israel. It annexes mainly water resources. And it imprisons, and I can give you all the numbers, it imprisons hundreds of thousands of Palestinians behind that wall in enclaves and isolates them from other Palestinians, not even from Israel. And it separates people from their own land. Your house could be on one side and your land on the other of the wall. Anyway, that wall we call the wall of separation and annexation. It embodies in many ways an injustice. It's a horrible, ugly wall with barbed wire and observation posts and so on. And it embodies the worst of the occupation. And not just that, but it steals our horizon. And I kept saying as a literary person, you cannot steal other people's horizons. This is the worst you can do to a nation, because if you do not see beyond that wall, you do not have a future. But the irony is that when you build a wall like that, you also imprison yourself behind it, and you imprison your own people behind it, and you don't make it possible for any future interaction. So instead of replacing, the current hostilities and the abnormal situation of occupation with good neighborly relations in the future, what you're doing is preparing for further distrust and hostilities. But as I was saying this morning, walls historically have been a failed policy. They've never succeeded, starting with the Great Wall of China all the way up to this current wall, and even the wall that is being built in the States and in Iraq and so on. Somehow the US sometimes picks up the worst of what Israel does and tries to implement it. It doesn't work. You can't build a wall with Mexico and think that it's going to work. People have ways, right, of finding their way through a wall, above a wall, below a wall. And historically they've done that. Anyway, so we have a wall. We have 640 checkpoints in the West Bank. I don't see one. Every time there's a new Secretary of State, we talk about the checkpoints. We talk about not just the siege of the West Bank and Gaza, but about the internal checkpoints. We are imprisoned. We're separated from each other. Town, city, village, camp. We cannot see each other. Families are separated and so on. I can't tell you all the implications of these checkpoints because they totally divide and separate the Palestinian people, so you cannot have a national system. You cannot have freedom of movement. You cannot have vaccination, for example, a national plan to vaccinate everybody. You cannot move freely. So these checkpoints manage to prevent us from having any type of normal life, any type of freedom of movement, and at the same time they destroy the economy. But that's just one thing. We have constant incursions. We're under siege and separation. At the same time, we have military incursions, assassinations, abductions, imprisonments, and all sorts of collective punitive. All these things, unilateralism, led to the increased militarism. Because when the only Israelis you see are the military and the checkpoints, then certainly there is no way in which you can have any normal discourse or dialogue with Israel. And the same thing, when the Israeli people are not allowed to see the Palestinians or to see what's happening to them, then they seem to think that the occupation somehow doesn't exist or is normal. And they refuse to see the consequences of this occupation. Even in 2002, this militarism, I remember The West Bank was reoccupied, and I said we're the only people who were under occupation and reoccupied, because we were shelled, we were bombed, and then we had the tanks, and we ended up, my house was under siege. I happened to live across from the Muqata, which is where the president lives. And this was before that an Israeli headquarters, and before that was the British mandate headquarters and prison and so on. So it's unfortunate, but I kept telling them we were there before they came, before the Israelis came, and they should... I had an agreement that they wouldn't cross the street. And I said, we wouldn't bother you, you don't bother us. But anyway, they did. So with the reoccupation, we saw systematically how Israeli tanks would come in, would destroy the street, first of all, the infrastructure, the street, then the electricity pylons, then the telephone poles, then the traffic lights. Then any car that's in the street was crushed, and so on. Systematically, and then would go into institutions and start destroying, first of all, the computers, the hard disks, and so on. So there was, in a way, multiple punishment. We're already captive, we're already, in many ways, helpless, and yet this reoccupation took place. And all this, of course, because unilateralism was allowed to go unchecked, and because there was an asymmetry of power, the war in Gaza is, to me, the culmination of this type of mentality, where you believe you can do whatever you want and get away with it, because there is no accountability, and because your victim is helpless and doesn't have powerful allies or friends to intervene or engage. And that, of course, leads to extremism. When you are faced with the language of ideology, militarism, unilateralism, extremism, then many people on your side start adopting the same approach as the only understandable language, because there's no other dialogue. Because if you carry out peaceful resistance, nobody listens to you. You go to the International Court, they take a ruling, nobody applies it, even on issues like the wall. And this led to the horrific war crimes that we saw a couple of months ago, where we had over 1,400 killed, 960 civilians, 288 children, 121 women. Even issues, political issues, like the unilateral disengagement from Gaza was unilateral. We kept saying, okay, you want to leave Gaza? And when was it, 2004? 2004? Five. Oof. Okay, do it as a result of a negotiated agreement, so that you can relinquish those powers, so that there is a Palestinian counterpart, negotiate an agreement. But they decided to do it unilaterally. And that left, of course, that strengthened the opposition, that strengthened Hamas. And we said it is not part of the roadmap, even though the American administration at that time tried to convince us it was. But that's another story. Now, all the conditionality was on the Palestinian side, and we talked about front-loading the process. There were all sorts of conditions on us. We had to prove that we were always on good behavior, on probation. We had to prove that we were worthy of attention. So any act of violence that took place anywhere, we were held responsible for. Even though these acts would be carried out by the opposition and by other factions, and yet it was the peace process that paid for it, and the Israelis were the sole arbiters. They were the ones who judged whether we were behaving well or not. Not the third party, not the Americans, not the international community. So, along with that, there was a systematic deconstruction of Palestinian realities, and gradually we found ourselves being transformed from an issue of nation building, development economies, building institutions, self-determination, independence, freedom, all these big words that we were using. We found ourselves suddenly or gradually transformed into a charity case, emergency relief, welfare, trying to undo the damage, and so on. And of course, like all military occupations that are not accountable, Israel had an endless reservoir of violations, and it always demanded payback. Whenever anybody would ask Israel to stop house demolitions, for example, or to lift the siege a bit, or to remove a few checkpoints, it demanded something in return. Hence you had Netanyahu's famous statement, they give, we give. What do we have to give? I mean, they have everything. They have our freedom, our land, and so on. And we were asked to pay for whatever they were supposed to stop doing at that point. Like, as I said, lift some of the checkpoints, or stop the incursions, or whatever. But anyway, so that ended up not getting anywhere. And rather than empowering the weak, or the occupied, the strong was allowed to use power politics and to exploit this imbalance to its advantage throughout the negotiating process. This was one major weakness. The second major weakness is the nature of third-party involvement. And we've always said that this peace in the Middle East is not a unilateral issue, of course, nor is it a bilateral issue given the asymmetry of power. It's a multilateral issue. It's an international responsibility. We didn't create this mess, and the Israelis and Palestinians alone cannot solve it because we're not even. And there is such a thing as international law and so on, and we needed positive, constructive engagement by a powerful, maybe the international community as a whole, I don't know, but by a third party that would be able to, as I said, curb the occupation, help the weak, and so on, and make sure that the process works. We ended up with sporadic sponsorship. One thing that the US administration was inconsistent in its attention to the peace process, so to speak. At one point, it would, like in Camp David, for example, in 2000, it was the last year of the Clinton administration, and they discovered too little too late that they had to do something about it. So they ended up micromanaging. They forced a meeting in Camp David and so on. And we'll talk about this later if you want. But it didn't produce results. Before that, they were busy with the Syrian track, and they felt that they could produce something with Syria, which they couldn't. And they played off one track against the other. From 2000 to 2007, we had the total vacuum. The previous administration certainly kept its distance, and when you have a political vacuum, as always, it is filled in our part of the world by violence and by extremism. And if there's no hope and no chance of peace, certainly it would implode from within, which is exactly what happened. 2008, of course, they discovered this is the last year, they better do something. Condi Rice was pushing for something. I think in the end she was the only one who thought that you could bring about some sort of agreement. And the Annapolis process, of course, fizzled out and didn't produce anything. And with that, the US always brought to bear its strategic alliance with Israel. And I said this in one of my briefings, I don't know if you remember, I said, by no stretch of the imagination can you ever accuse the Americans of being even-handed when it comes to us and the peace process. So there was a strategic alliance. And now people are speaking out. When they were negotiating with us, they kept saying, no, that's not it. But now Dan Kurtzer, for example, wrote about the obvious bias towards Israel. It was Aaron Miller, I think, who really spoke out. And he said that the basic problem was that we decided we played the role of Israel's lawyer, he said, in negotiations. At one point when I was busy negotiating with the Americans, the things that the Israelis had accepted on the Israeli-Palestinian track, the Americans would not accept for Israel. So they were sort of more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak. So people like Dan Kurtzer, Aaron, even Martin Indyk, are now writing their books. If you read their books, you will see that they accuse themselves of not being even-handed. And there were standard policies. I wrote about this. I don't have time to discuss it, but they always, for example, cleared things up with the Israelis before. They had an agreement, never surprised the Israelis. Every American text that we got was 90% Israeli diction and 10% maybe even American. And they always cleared it up with the Israelis and then brought it to us and they said this is American policy. Anyway, we understand, of course, the letter of assurance that Ed always talks about, because we went through several texts, several layers of textual criticism, if you will, and we ended up with a letter of assurances that was the basis on which we went to negotiations. Then when the time came and we said, okay, we have a letter of assurances, it should be implemented, they said, no, that cannot be brought to bear on the negotiation. That's American policy. It has nothing to do with negotiations. We said, this is the letter you gave us, but it was never honored, never implemented, even though it was let's say, a semi-decent letter which said that, for example, that no unilateral actions will be accepted, particularly settlements in and around Jerusalem. Remember, we fought for months on this term, and we got it in the letter of assurances, but then Israel built settlements, took over Jerusalem, and so on, and the Americans said nothing. Nothing. So that wasn't brought to bear. Yet, on April 14th, and I digress, but just to give you the contrast, April 14th, 2004, remember that date, Dov Weissglass was in the White House, and he was negotiating a letter that they wanted from the Bush administration. And I got to learn of that letter, and I called Candy Rice, and she said, talk to Steve Hadley. I talked to Steve Hadley, and I found out, because we knew that they were giving assurances to the Israelis now about the settlements. And in that letter, at one point, actually, I told the American administration they should start charging Dov Weissglass, who was Sharon's advisor, rent in the White House, because he spent more time in the White House than in Israel. But anyway, this was the letter that they wrote, the speech that Bush gave, talking about taking into account demographic changes on the ground. Remember that? I don't know if any of you remembers that notorious speech or letter, in which the US made itself complicit in illegal actions. You cannot say that Israel can violate international law, can bring its own people to live on occupied territory, we can build settlement, and any agreement has to take into account these facts created on the ground by Israel. That's why we felt that there was no even-handedness at any point anywhere. Of course, we didn't expect the US to wake up one day and decide there was a grave injustice done to the Palestinians, but at least it has to understand that its own interests, its own integrity, its own standing are all affected by what it does in Palestine. And we will get to that later. Anyway, the American team also had an agenda. They certainly weren't Arabists. Remember, at a certain point, they accused the State Department all of having Arabists, and then there was this coup, and then you had the State Department all as reflecting the political map of Israel. I said we were looking at the team and saying one was for pro-peace now, one was pro-labor, one was pro-Likud, one was pro-Meretz, but you couldn't say one was pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab. They all reflected the political map of Israel, but not. And they had an agenda, particularly Danes, and now I can speak. I'm not a diplomat, so I can speak out. Danes Ross had a clear Likud agenda and worked with AIPAC and so on. So the decisions that were taken, and he took over, I think, much of the work of the foreign policy. And that kind of intervention certainly did not bode well for the prospects of peace and did not serve the peace process at all. Many asked us at one point, what's the greatest obstacle to peace, thinking we would say the settlements and so on. We said in the States, it's Dennis Ross. But now he's the envoy to Iran, and one has to be careful, because we don't want any more military adventures in our part of the world. And we understand that there are domestic constraints. We know the power of the lobby in the US and so on. Now, again, Camp David, those of you who read what Rob Malley and Hussein Laga wrote about Camp David understand that blaming the Palestinians certainly did not work, particularly because the official version of the myth of the generous offer was certainly a myth and not a reality. And then there was the formation of the quartet. We thought that the quartet is a signal that there is international intervention. But the quartet, as you know, is a strange creature. You put together the superpower with regional powers, with has-been power, with the UN, and you say, okay, all of you now are supposed to make peace. And I said, well, if you disagree, whom do you go to if the UN is part of this? And the US decided that it has the power to allocate powers and responsibilities, to activate or deactivate the quartet at will. And it defined, of course, responsibilities and the political terrain and so on. So when we had that roadmap, it was more honored by non-implementation than by implementation. Israel had 14 reservations. We were told that these reservations will be incorporated not in the text, but in the implementation. So it's very warm. So The roadmap certainly was not honored or implemented. Even reports like the Zinni report, the Mitchell report, you've heard Mitchell came over and he looked at on the ground and he saw what's happening, and he said that there has to be intervention when it comes to settlements and when it comes to flashpoints, areas of conflict and so on. But again, there was no political will to pursue even the American reports themselves. Now I hope that Mitchell will have the ear of the presidency at least and will implement whatever decisions or recommendations he has. In Annapolis, again, I don't want to go through too many details, but again, it was too little too late. The previous administration, the Bush administration, finally decided that it has to do something about it. After 7 years of hiatus and doing nothing, it decided that in 1 year it's going to bring about peace. We said, fine, I mean, if you have a magic wand, show us, and we're very happy to help. But again, from November 2007 till now, too little, too late, nothing happened. There was no political will really to stop any of the unilateral actions. And because the third party did not exercise some of the things that it talked about, including monitoring and verification, arbitration, engagement on the ground, or guarantees, therefore, there was non-compliance every step of the way. Even signed agreements were not honored. At one point, I remember Clinton was negotiating himself with Netanyahu all the details of Hebron. Remember the Hebron agreement? The American president discussing the vegetable market, the Hisbe, and discussing really the Martyr Street and where would the Palestinians be and so on. And this is what happened. Netanyahu drew the American administration from the presidency on down to discuss the minutiae, the smallest technical details, and they forgot the larger picture. They forgot the occupation, but they were discussing how much of Hebron can the Israelis control and how much can the Palestinians, and they renegotiated the protocols on Hebron, which were agreed to even previously. So I'm telling you, this is one way in which the third party was neutralized. And this is what I'm sure Netanyahu will do again. But three, there were also structural and intrinsic flaws. They weren't all third party and Israeli behavior. The separation of tracks, and instead of a comprehensive and inclusive approach, there were separate tracks. So Israel was able to play off one track against the other, and the favorite playing off was Syria versus the Palestinians. And again, the gradual or the phased approach. We're talking about this. When you postpone the central or crucial issues to the end, and you start dealing only with side issues, peripheral issues, technical issues, including CBMs, confidence building measures, then you leave the real issues, which are the core of the problem, till later, which allows the powerful party to preempt them and prejudge them. And in the meantime, you're there dealing with all these technical and side issues that get you nowhere. Our approach when we started with Adam and James Baker and so on was, no, we go straight to the major points. You solve the core, you untie or you get rid of the Gordian knot somehow or that. Everything else falls in place. It's very easy to. But if you want an easy fix, you can say, okay, you know, I solved how the Palestinians are going to clear up their garbage, for example. And you don't get anywhere. And this is why we objected when they adopted the functional rather than the territorial approach. The whole peace process was functional, not territorial. The issue to us is land, legality, justice. These are issues that to the Palestinians form the basic problem. It is not whether we can be administrators under the occupation. I was telling the president today how when we were under occupation in the 1980s, Menachem Milson came up with the idea of the civil administration and the whole quality of life, that if you improve the quality of life of Palestinians, they will be happy and docile under the occupation. So let's give them administrative responsibility. They called us and offered us, of course, when they call us, you cannot say no, because you get a summons. And they said, okay, now you can run your schools, you can run your hospitals, you can clean up your garbage, you can do all these things, we'll give you all these administrative responsibilities. And we said, sorry, I mean, we built our universities, we built our schools, we're running our hospitals, but under occupation. There was always a military officer that was in charge of all these things. And as an occupier, you are responsible. We don't want to be administrators or functionaries under the occupation. We want to be free. If you want us to run our lives, then you leave, and we will be in charge, and we will do a good job. We don't need the occupation. But that didn't work. So now, in negotiations, these were the issues that were discussed and that were offered. And that's why when we saw the DOP, the Declaration of Principles that was signed in 1993, in September, we were shocked. It was, of course, negotiated in secret. It was signed because it adopted precisely the functional approach, the gradual approach, separation of people and the land, and so on. And it dissociated nation building from peacemaking. From the beginning, we had no hidden agenda. We said we want to see the devolution of occupation, evolution of statehood. We want to see the end of occupation and the building of the Palestinian state. These two are parallel, simultaneous, interdependent processes, and they have to be done. But instead, we ended up with the opposite. We ended up with the devolution of statehood and the evolution of occupation. The occupation really reinvented itself to become a system of control, not just without accountability, but without responsibility. Like they said we disengaged from Gaza, but they gave themselves control over the territorial waters, the airspace, the crossing points, and overall security control, so they could bomb and shell, and abduct and so on at will and assassinate. So we had a new kind of occupation that had all the powers, none of the responsibilities, and no accountability. And we, as Palestinians, saw the devolution, what I describe as the deconstruction, of all components of Palestinian statehood. Even things that we had built were falling apart. And that led to Palestinian realities unraveling. And there's a very, very interesting book by Ilan Pape, on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, where he describes clearly what he calls the displacement-replacement paradigm, not just in terms of institutions and land and taking over and so on, but even in terms of names and language, naming our towns and cities and villages. So this kind of reversal certainly was done in the name of peacemaking. There were no problem-solving mechanisms, dispute resolution, arbitration, and there was certain selectivity in the terms of reference, 242 and 338. Now, the preamble to 242 and 338 says the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, right? But they've always ignored that and talked about whether the article that talks about all the occupied territories or not. And as you know, that was prejudged and prejudiced. And they told us that these were subject to interpretation, not to implementation. This is strange. When it comes to the Palestinians, the whole world waxes creative. They started redefining sovereignty for us, sometimes above ground, underground. They started inventing things like a state with transitional borders, which never happened anywhere. And now they're telling us that UN resolutions and international law are not for implementation, they're just for interpretation. So there we were. And there was no respect, of course, or adherence to those. For the process, therefore, gained a life of its own, became a process for its own sake, with no relationship to reality, and it was no longer a means to an end. It was an end unto itself. And so long as, Dennis Ross felt, there were careers made out of that process, as you know. We started, not in 1991 with Baker, we started actually earlier when we were discussing the different prospects. In 1988, and the PLO took the resolution to accept the two-state solution. But anyway, so from 1988, or if you want to be specific, 1991, till now, we haven't seen a single advancement in peace, but we've seen more loss of land, more loss of lives, more suffering, and so on. So and Dennis kept saying, so long as there's a process, the two parties are talking to each other, that's fine. Well, so if the process is ongoing and God's in his heaven and all's well with the world, what's happening on the ground? The situation kept deteriorating, and there was a serious regression, and the process became a cover. Even up to the last minute, Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas were negotiating, up to the last minute, and getting nowhere. And they were building more settlements, taking more land, completing the siege, building the wall, but they were talking. So the language itself became much more important than reality. Anyway, well, in the beginning was the word, but of course the word became man ultimately, and it's action, and you can't just be satisfied only with the word. Consequently, the process lost its credibility, and we lost our constituency for peace and moderation, and the Palestinian leadership that took the decision to enter this process was undermined. And this became very clear, particularly with the persistent Israeli claim that there was no peace partner. Anytime they didn't want to implement anything, they would attack the Palestinian leadership and say there is no peace partner, and that became an excuse or a rationalization, not just to negate the partnership for peace and negotiations, but to avoid implementation of any signed agreements. Remember Arafat, who came to the States, who was seen as, the peacemaker, suddenly was demonized. He was declared, irrelevant, and he was boycotted, and then he was besieged, and then his headquarters were shelled. Of course, as a byproduct, our house lost all its doors and windows, and my daughters felt they were being killed. But anyway, so you ended up with the whole attitude that you always can blame the Palestinians for everything, particularly that there's no peace partner, and get away with it. And that continued undermining not just the process, but the credibility and the constituency for peace. And now we end up with the rise of violence and extremism on both sides, ideology and militarism, the failure of the peace process to deliver, and of course, along with that, and this is a major strategic shortcoming, the rapidly disappearing two-state solution. I mean, this is something that has to be addressed very seriously. It's not an abstract threat. It's not even a demographic issue. We'll discuss this if you want. But when you lose the territorial viability and contiguity of the Palestinian state, then there is no two-state solution. And if you don't have a Palestinian state, then you do not have peace. There are those who talk about a one-state solution, whether as a de facto situation or as a political option, but we can discuss that later. That means that we will be condemned to stay under occupation for generations to come, and Israel to continue its prejudicial actions. And of course, those who base everything on a demographic argument, seems to me, are adopting not just a racist but also a sexist approach, because many Israelis tell me the ultimate ticking time bomb is the Palestinian woman's womb. And it's not a race as to how many, it's not numerical, it's not quantitative, the issue is qualitative. The issue is, do we have the right to live in freedom on our own land, or are we just a demographic threat to Israel? That's the real issue. And of course, there was a serious impact on internal domestic Palestinian realities. The rise of Hamas, for example, is in inverse proportion to the failure of the peace camp or the peace agenda. Of course, there were many other reasons which we can discuss. The decreasing support for Fatah, the PLO and the national or secular forces lost, and in the elections of 2005, Hamas, the January 2006, Hamas got the larger vote. That's also because of the abuse of power, misuse of public funds, and so on, as well. So we cannot blame it all on the lack of progress in the peace process. There was also increased support for armed struggle as a means of resistance rather than nonviolent popular resistance or negotiations as a means of resolution, because they saw that neither of those led anywhere. And ultimately we ended up with an internal rift, violent confrontations culminating in the Hamas's military takeover of Gaza, which led to internal Palestinian weaknesses and had a negative impact on the standing of and support for the Palestinian question, the Palestinian cause. And we end up also with a built-in leadership crisis at all levels. I mean, I'm not saying that only Hamas or only Fatah or only PLO. We do have a serious leadership crisis, which we'll talk about if you want later. But there is a again, a blow to Palestinian democracy. As you know, we were building this step by step, but we got only lip service to Palestinian democracy because when Hamas won the elections, we were boycotted. All the Palestinians were punished, and we were ostracized. And for about 2 years, nobody was paid in the civil service and the security because everybody decided that democracy is fine provided you guarantee the outcome of elections. If you elect the wrong people, you will be punished. And we were punished. And that led to the Palestinian people sort of, again, losing any confidence in Western claims to democracy and American claims to exporting the democratic revolution a la Yadin. Not only that, but for decades Israel was violating international law and our rights and so on, and we said, okay, some sort of accountability, sanctions. They said, don't even dream of it. No sanctions, no punishment for Israel. But we elected the wrong party and we ended up under sanctions. We're already under occupation. So they punished us for that. And that, again, did not bode well for Palestinian democracy, particularly because Israel and the US decided to usurp the role of the opposition. Now, if Hamas were allowed to govern, there would be a natural democratic situation where you have a majority and an opposition. And we were quite willing to be the opposition. I certainly would like the chance to be the opposition in parliament. I was elected and I won. But we couldn't because they usurped our role. And if you stood up and opposed Hamas, everybody, you're an American agent, an Israeli lackey, quisling, because it's Israel and the US that are boycotting and punishing Hamas. And if you play the role of the opposition, then you are part of them. Of course, it turned Hamas into the victim and the underdog, which got it more support. Now, they had money because they could get money. They smuggled money through tunnels. They had support from their own sources and so on. So who ended up without money as a result of the boycott? The moderates, the PLO guys, the Fatah guys, all the people who relied on international support and cooperation to pay the salaries of the civil service and so on. They ended up not getting any funding. They were punished, and Hamas ended up with all the funding that it could use and need through its own sources. And we ended up with a battle over the soul of Palestine. I'm sure now the conditions on Hamas, the international conditions, is that it recognize Israel, moderate its political stance. As far as we're concerned, that's not the issue. They may recognize Israel, may not recognize Israel, it's a problem. What we are looking at is the nature of Palestinian society and culture. Do we want a closed, ideological, repressive system, or do we want an open, tolerant, pluralistic, inclusive system? To me, this is the real issue. What are women's rights? What do we mean when we talk about rule of law? What are the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms? If we have a system that gets its mandate from God directly, what does that do to these rights and freedoms? That, to me, is the real question, the nature of Palestinian society. That's why we talk about the battle over the soul of Palestine, not whether Hamas recognizes Israel or not. Look, there are racist parties in Israel all the time, people who advocate the expulsion and the ethnic cleansing and the killing of Palestinians. Nobody says we won't talk to them. We'll boycott them, we'll punish all Israelis because they have racist parties. And yet, because Hamas does not want to recognize Israel, they say we won't talk to it. Why should it recognize Israel? The government that is elected will recognize Israel. That's enough. Any government will have to recognize signed agreements. The PLO recognized Israel. So, in a way, that was really unrealistic. But the issue for me is not that. The issue is not how to tame Hamas politically or even how to tame it militarily, because they really gave it a bashing, but they killed the innocent civilians in Gaza, not Hamas. Hamas came out almost unscathed and came out triumphant because, again, it was attacked by Israel and it survived. All it had to do was survive, and it became more powerful. And I don't want to go into this issue of total vilification and total vindication and this extreme polarization in Palestine, but what we need is to heal the rift, to have Hamas as part of a pluralistic democratic system, not as outside the system, and we cannot look at it as a substitute or a replacement for the PLO or an alternative. And again, we can talk about that later because people are discussing what to do with the PLO now. Now, the contextual components of peace, the whole region is still reeking from the impact of the disastrous so-called war on terrorism, with all the consequent habits of unilateralism, militarism, polarization, ideology, the axis of evil. I mean, the post-September 11 universe was lethal to not just the region, not just to Iraq and so on, but to the peacemaking and to the Palestinians as a whole. And the rift in the Arab world, again, that's a larger topic we can talk about, led to a sense of threat to the pro-Western moderate regimes from rising Islamist parties and movements. Conventional wisdom historically was that the Arab regimes, especially the pro-Western ones, did not want a Palestinian state because they were worried that democracy is contagious, or there's a spillover effect, or Palestinians are troublemakers, and so on. So lots of Americans would tell us in secret that the Arab world may talk about a Palestinian state, but they really come and say they don't want one. Now, they've reversed that position, because they've discovered that if the Palestinian question is not solved, then, and if Israel continues, then the rise of extremism, the rise of militant Islam threatens the stability of the region and the longevity of these regimes. So now they really desperately want to see a solution, and they want the Palestinian state. That's why now they're also sponsoring meetings and so on. Now, the Arab world is also polarized. Some are sponsoring Hamas, some are sponsoring Fatah, and we ended up paying the price. There will be a summit at the end of this month. We'll see. The dialogue is not proceeding as rapidly or substantially as we want. And there were, again, we don't have time to discuss these, misguided theories of the new Middle East, the broader Middle East, remember, the greater Middle East, and that they discovered that our problem was a democracy and freedom deficit in the Middle East. Well, this is fine. We have reform movements, we have democratic movements, we have homegrown, authentic movements, and we're working on these things. Our problem is the freedom deficit that we get from being under the occupation. Our problem is that the US and other countries have ignored the long-standing grievances and conflicts that have plagued the region for decades. That's the problem. That's what's holding us back. And I was part of the Human Development Report for many years. This is the real issue. And the real issue is that when you have a security threat like that, you waste your resources, you buy weapons, you avoid or evade accountability and human rights and democracy because you're facing an imminent threat. But you get rid of that threat, you resolve that conflict, you end up with a situation where democracy will flourish by the efforts and initiatives of the people themselves. You don't need to export the neocon revolution to Palestine at all. I mean, you have enough difficulties with it here in the US and wreaked havoc here in the US, so please keep it away from. Anyway, so we don't need that. What we need is a positive engagement to solve conflicts, political conflicts. We don't need patronage when it comes to democracy and reform. And of course, I cannot tell you about the impact of the war on Iraq, the destabilization, and the rise of extremism and terrorism and the emergence of Iran. Of course, without the war on Iraq, Iran would not have been such a power. But at the same time, Iran cannot be seen as the address for the next military adventure. That's very serious. And I agree with Ed on that. And the last thing we need is another war. The exclusion of Syria is a factor as well and has to be dealt with. We talk about an inclusive, comprehensive peace process. And the impact on Palestine, of course, as a result of this polarization. And then we have an Arab initiative that is an opportunity missed, that has not been honored or implemented. The Arabs, as a result of all these factors, decided that they can place state things simply. Not because Tom Friedman went to then Prince Abdullah and convinced him to make that initiative. But they said, if you return the land you occupied in 1967 to its rightful owners, we will recognize Israel. That this is the cause of the conflict. And instead of jumping at the opportunity, there was all this yes, but, and we'll see, and it might be a basis for agreement. Instead of the Americans saying, okay, there you are, this is the key to the whole region, they ignored it completely. For years they ignored it. And now they're trying to see whether it can be adopted, adapted, and modified. We'll see. And again, there was a political shift to hardline extremism and ideology in Israel. And we're seeing the new government, the formation of the new government. We will talk about that. But I believe when you have religious absolutism with extremist militarism and with blatant racism forming a government, it certainly is not going to serve the course of peace. We find ourselves in another time warp, and we do need a confluence of auspicious political developments and factors. We see a new American administration making noises, saying they want to be engaged, and of course they appointed Mitchell, which is a good sign. And we'll see whether he has the mandate and the power. Then you have in Israel this shift of terrain to the extreme, and you have in Palestine this division which we're trying to heal. And that again makes peacemaking that much more difficult. What are the new directions and requirements if peace is still attainable? I'm not sure it is, by the way. The new administration, there are all sorts of voices now. People like Richard Haas are calling for begin negotiations with Syria, it's easier. Again, playing off that Syria and Israel can come to an agreement much more easily than Palestine and Israel, which is true, but of course with this new government in Israel, they don't want to return the Golan Heights to Syria, so that becomes irrelevant. If you don't return the land, you're not going to get anywhere. And there are voices that are calling for conflict management rather than solution, buying time because you cannot solve it, it's too difficult. In the meantime, if you buy time, Israel will create facts on the ground and will undermine any possibility of an agreement. Others say let's maintain the status quo, what they call controlled chaos, remember the theory? And let's enhance that rift between Gaza and the West Bank, and Gaza will go to Egypt, and the West Bank will be administered by Jordan. Again, this is the fragmentation of the Palestinian case, which is a recipe for perpetual future conflict and instability. Then you have this new economic piece by Netanyahu, which reminds us of the 1980s and Milson, quality of life. Let's make their life economically better and the Palestinians will acquiesce. That's not going to work. It's a tired and tried argument. And we see the continuation of the dissolution and deconstruction of Palestine, population centers under siege and separated from each other and within the wall, and will carry out the silent invisible transfer, which is the not so silent policy of Lieberman and the Israel Beitenu party, the transfer of Palestinian. And there are those who talk about one state or a binational state also as a de facto solution. Now, if, as claimed, there is a global consensus on two-state solution rather late, and if the U.S., then the U.S. is to play a pivotal role in peacemaking. Quite a few policy papers, suggestions, advice papers were written, and letters and so on, including yours in your book to the new administration. There's much in the Hamilton-Baker report and so on, the bipartisan report on how to deal with the region. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Brzezinski, Crowcroft, all these people wrote about what needs to be done. But I can say very quickly, the U.S. must distance itself from the disastrous policies of the past immediately, avoid all the mistakes, undo the damage, roll up its sleeves, and re-engage constructively immediately. We don't have time. They must think and act outside the box. New policy, new discourse. You cannot say that building settlements is unhelpful, which is what Hillary Clinton said. No, building settlements is illegal and destructive. It's not unhelpful. There are all these euphemisms. We started out with settlements as being illegal. We ended up obstacles to peace. We ended up with unhelpful, unwise at one point, and so on. The language somehow should. So you need to change the discourse, and you need a new team. If you resuscitate the old team, we're dead. We need a new approach. And of course, as I said, the envoy, George Mitchell, is a positive sign. He knows the situation. He's been a peacemaker. He succeeded in Ireland. And he needs to be empowered by the presidency. He needs to act. And he cannot spend time exploring. We need to move rapidly, act with urgency, effectiveness, and decisiveness. Now, we all know that the Palestinian cause, as you wrote, Ed, is the most emotive, the most focal issue in the region. It is a visible, concrete expression of an ongoing injustice. It shapes attitudes, it shapes perceptions, and it shapes policies in the region, the Palestinian cause. Anybody who tells you it's Iran or Iraq or Syria or whatever is wrong. It's the Palestinian question. So it must not be left up for grabs by anybody who wants to borrow our integrity or our constituency, to be exploited by extremists and ideological agendas, and it mustn't be a card in a regional political poker game. Solving the Palestinian question is key to solving most of the problems of the region. And of course, with a global impact. Deal with the region as an integrated whole and understand its context and interdependencies. Part of the problem was that there was an assumption that everybody thinks and acts like an American. This isn't true. We have lots of cultural luggage, we have lots of attitudes, we have lots of traditions, we have ways in which we make agreements, and you cannot sort of say, I'm going to set up a simple construct and paradigm and you all fit in it. No, we don't. You have to understand the complexities of the region and deal with them responsibly. And of course, adopt a multi-tiered or a triple-tiered approach to the Palestinian question. On the ground, of course, bring Israel to compliance. I don't have time to go through all the violations, but these have to stop. The ICJ ruling must be implemented on the wall. The siege of Gaza must be lifted, the West Bank, and so on. And we need a reciprocal comprehensive ceasefire, not just in Gaza, and it has to be simultaneous in the West Bank as well, and a prisoner exchange. Politically, they must support internal Palestinian dialogue and reconciliation, and the recognition of a pluralistic democratic system, and accept the fact that we need a government of national accord. You cannot say, okay, I will boycott some Palestinians and I will punish some. Some are kosher, others are not. If we have a government, you have to deal with it. If we have a democracy, you deal with it. This is what happens in democracies. There are people you don't like, but you cannot sort of punish them. And we ask for assistance in national, legislative, and presidential elections, monitoring, but not intervention, not meddling, monitoring. And empower all authentic homegrown initiatives for reform and good governance, particularly security reform and restructuring, rule of law, human rights, without, of course, being part of domestic politics and trying to support one side against the other. And the more they praise one side, the more they kill that side and weaken it and destroy its credibility. This is what they did to Abu Mazen, to Mahmoud Abbas, even to Salam Fayyad. They kept praising him till the Palestinians thought, well, he's an American agent. And this is the great argument used by Hamas and others to attack them. Economically, a massive multilateral program of reconstruction and development, nation and institution building, not again, and as we said, end, not fund the occupation, and ensure required conditions, including freedom of movement, to build a national economy. And simultaneously, we need to launch a viable and effective peace initiative, not a process. Avoid all the flaws and pitfalls of the past, reaffirm the terms of reference, UN resolutions, international law, principle of justice. We have the Arab Peace Initiative, we make use of that. Expand and reform the quartet. If you want, even form a coalition of the willing for peace this time, not for war. We need an international conference for the implementation of these agreements, not a debating society, a conference to discuss a timetable and implementation with a binding timetable, and no need to reinvent the wheel. We know what the issues are, the permanent status issues, and they mustn't be prejudged or prejudiced. Again, it's time to consider UN involvement, supervision, caretakership, protector, whatever you want. We need to separate ourselves from this lethal relationship with Israel. So we are quite willing to accept international troops, peacekeepers, not the ghostly presence of the temporary international presence in Hebron, TIF, as it's called in Arabic. These guys, go there, look around, a handful of them. They write their reports to the governments that are read in secret, and they're placed in drawers. And the TIF guys in Hebron get beaten up. They get the Palestinian treatment. Quite often they're expelled. They don't have any power, and nobody reads their reports. No, we need international troops on the ground. And we need to address overall security issues in a regional Arab context and not subject to Israeli priorities, and not just in military terms. Security is not just military. We need economic security, territorial, even cultural and personal security, and a dialogue. I like the idea that Obama decided that he's not going to boycott, ostracize everybody, and he's not going to start delivering, good housekeeping seals that we can talk to you and we're not going to talk to you. So in a sense, it's much better to be able to have inclusion rather than ostracism and boycott. This is how you get people on board. Countries like Syria and Iran, I'm glad we don't have devils and angels anymore. But one thing we must work on is that the whole region must be nuclear-free, the nuclear-free zone. You cannot single out Iran, for example. No, the whole region. If anybody needs a map, I can show them where Dimona is. More than 200 thermonuclear warheads in Israel. And it's an old reactor, and it is leaking. I think there are all sorts of problems with it. But it's the one place, it's the elephant in the room. This is where the nuclear weapons are in our midst, and totally non-transparent, without any kind of inspection or supervision. So, and of course, there was an article last week by Henry Siegman in Haaretz, in which he advocates that the U.S. should play a decisive, tough role, and without the U.S. telling Israel that there are limits to its behavior, there's not going to be any more peace. Now, dear friends, Palestine is a luminous promise ready to be materialized, regardless of the present conditions of pain and precariousness. It requires an act of collective will and the courage to bring about a historical redemption of human and global magnitude. That's why it's imperative to speak out, but it's even more imperative to act before it's too late. Thank you for your patience and indulgence. Thank you very much.
I think you all see where Hanan Ashrawi stands. We have a few minutes for questions, and I will call on the, first over here and then second here. Gentleman there, please identify yourself.
My name is Said Fatouh. I'm a producer and host of Arab Voices Radio Talk Show. It's good to see you in Houston again. I've had you on the show before.
Ahlan, yes, I remember.
Dr. Ashrawi, question. The latest Israeli war on Gaza, 1,430 Palestinians killed, thousands injured. Specifically over the past 72 hours, new information has surfaced coming from the Israeli soldiers themselves for the first time probably in history. Several of them giving reports that they were told to kill, no matter what. Ambulances, medical staff, rabbis gave them information that this is a religious war, this is a God-given land, go take it. So it's clear and obvious now it was a war crime. They were there to shoot and kill no matter what. Why doesn't the Palestinian Authority and of course the international community in the U.S. seize that moment to stop Israel? Enough is enough of war crimes. Now it's coming from the mouth of the Israeli soldiers.
Okay, we don't have, please, just a question.
Well, actually, we didn't wait until we got the reports from the Israeli soldiers. People were asking the authority why not start a a lawsuit against Israel for war crimes. There are several ways in which you can follow up the issue legally, as you know. You can go to the ICJ, International Court of Justice, which means you have to be a state to do it. You can go to the ICC, International Criminal Court, and start a lawsuit. And you can do this through civil society institutions as well. You can ask for a specific tribunal. You can ask for individual countries that have laws against this also. So all these, I think there were 5 ways, all these means were looked at and were approached. And there are now lawsuits for war crimes. The Israeli soldiers started, there is a group, an organization of Israeli soldiers called Breaking the Silence. These were the soldiers who were talking about what they did in the incursions in the West Bank. Then they encouraged the soldiers to speak out about what they did in Gaza. This is new. And last week, I think, they started. And that's when the world stood up and took notice. We were talking about this. People saw it live on television, saw the white phosphorus bombs, saw the cluster bombs, saw the most densely populated area in the world being, relentlessly bombed, residential areas, institutions, 22,000 buildings totally demolished, many of them residential buildings and so on. Whole families were obliterated. Now, we have the documentation. We have lots of information. There are international as well as Palestinian organizations that have started the ball rolling. You will see war crimes tribunals. The issue is whether we can have a special tribunal for Israel or not. We cannot ask for it. It has to be through the international, I think. I don't know. I'm not an international lawyer. Any of you can help me with that. I think it has to go through the UN. And there were reports in the UN talking about the need for an international tribunal, and there are soldiers who are saying that they did get instructions and they did get from the rabbis the fatwa that they have to, that this is, that their lives are much more important than Palestinian lives, so they can, in cases of danger, they can shoot to kill Palestinians.
Gentlemen, please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name is Ira Blywise from Native Houstonian. Kind of curious about your presentation here. And also this gentleman's comments back. Here are some of the facts. Were there not war crimes on both sides? Not a war crime to dress soldiers as civilians and to use human shields, which have all been well documented. You cited statistics about 1,400 dead civilians, yet we hear no statistics about any Palestinian fighters having been killed in this last operation. But what's more of a concern for me is when you come up here in front of a prestigious institute like Baker Institute and spend 45 minutes totally vilifying Israel and say, well, now I'm going to move on to other subjects, and completely vilify Israel, we have heard nothing about responsibility from the Palestinians. We have heard nothing about Hamas murdering their own. You know, it was a democratic election. Well, we know it was democratic because they murdered the Palestinians.
Okay, please ask the question.
What
is the question?
The question is that when you present distortions like this to an audience that may not be completely familiar with the history, how does that help the peace process, or does that indeed serve to undermine the peace process?
Well, I think because I'm there, and because I know what's happening, and because everything I talked about is documented, I don't consider them distortions. I'm trying to present the truth because it rarely gets heard or listened to in the States. You don't get to see what's happening on the ground. Unless, of course, the Israelis start exposing it, then it becomes the truth. And they are. There are brave Israeli voices that are speaking out, that are not just documenting what's happening. Years ago, somebody like Shulamit Aloni said that we are committing war crimes, and she started compiling files. Now, I'm talking about the occupation. I'm not vilifying the Israelis. There's an Israeli peace camp that has been active. There are Israeli voices that are courageous and brave and honest, that do not try to justify everything, that do not look for what the Palestinians under occupation are doing and saying, well, then they deserve what happens to them. You cannot always blame the victim. The occupation is the source of the problems. It's an abnormal situation. It generates abnormal behavior, whether on the part of the occupier who thinks that he or she is unaccountable and has limitless power, or on the part of the occupied who want to resist their oppression. And of course, not all resistance is polite and pleasant and peaceful. And I talked about we have internal rifts, yes. I disagree with Hamas, yes. fine. And I said they resorted to violence. Yes, there was civil strife. There was internal, almost a civil war. Yes. So, does that give Israel the right to enslave a whole nation? To expel us? To kill us? No, it doesn't. We're not perfect. And we're not perfect victims either. See? So we're not going to lie down and die quietly. But at the same time, we're not blaming all our ills on the occupation or on Israel. What we need to do is to deal with the causes. It's very easy to blame the victim. It's very easy to say, look, the Palestinians are fighting, therefore they can't have peace. Or the Palestinians, some of them used violence, therefore they're all terrorists. What breeds violence? What breeds a situation in which a whole people feel that they are totally vulnerable? The occupation. You get rid of the causes, then you have a more normal and human situation. But those who try constantly to give Israel more room, to wreak more havoc, and to justify what it's doing, are not doing Israel a favor. I know you think you are, but you're not. Because there are Israelis, and they are advocating what they call tough love for Israel. They're saying that because the US has allowed Israel to go to extreme measures and to get away with these things, they are destroying the two-state solution. They are destroying the strategic safety and security of Israel as a country in the region. So these are the voices I would like to listen to. I know you hear a lot about Israel in the States, but I think I come here and I'm an academic and I know what it means to speak out and to have academic integrity. Don't worry. I'm not inventing any of these things. These things happen, they're all documented, and you can see them if you want to. And I'm not saying them because I want to say Israel is bad. I'm saying them because I say we need intervention and we need peace desperately, a just peace. And we need to stop glossing over what Israel is doing, and we need to save it sometimes from itself. And we need to rescue peace from the occupation. Thank you.
No,
I think that's
you've had a lot of people who have their hands up, and I want to, the lady back there.
You spoke earlier about it being all about the land. Would the Palestinians be content with going back to 1967? Or is what you really want to do is to go back before the Israelis ever even came?
No, I think if you go back to 1988, the PLO, the PNC, which is the Palestine National Council, our parliament in exile, took a resolution accepting the two-state solution and accepting 1967 as the boundaries of it. So there's a binding resolution there. Now, when we entered the peace process, we entered on the basis of 242 and 338, UN resolutions that talk about 67. 67 boundaries or lines constitute 22% of historical Palestine for the Palestinians. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, are 22% of historical Palestine. The rest, where Israel is now, would be 78% of historical Palestine. So it was a major, major compromise that the Palestinians have accepted this. And we have. The problem is that in any peace process or attempt, they're trying to tell us, well, how much more of this 22% are you going to give to Israel? How much land are you going to give them for the settlements? How much? That's the thing. I mean, 22% is the least that on which we can build a Palestinian state that's viable. And it has to be territorially contiguous. So no, 22% of historical Palestine is the compromise that the Palestinians made, and it wasn't easy. It was very painful, and we're committed to it. But if we continue to see it being eroded and taken away and confiscated, then there's no chance of a two-state solution. Then voices will call for all of Palestine again.
There's so many questions. I have this gentleman here. Yep.
You just talked about...
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Michael Duke, I'm with the Jewish Herald Voice. In reference to this previous question, you talked about going back to 1967. So you do want to return Gaza to Egypt, and you do want to return the West Bank to Jordan?
No, we're talking about 1960.
That's who was controlling it in 1960.
That's exactly what the Israelis would like, not Gaza. They would like Gaza to go to Egypt. That's because when the State of Israel was created in 1947, 48, they took over 56% of Palestine, and then after 67 they occupied the rest. But Well, in 48 they took 22%, and in 67 the rest 22%. So we agreed not to go back to the partition lines, not to go back to 1947, but we agreed to go to 1967, which Israel, 22% of which Israel took by an act of war in 48. All right? Now, who runs what is our business. All we need is Israel to relinquish the land which does not belong to it. Now, I personally think, and most Palestinians think, that this land should be returned to the Palestinians. After, in 1951, in the West Bank, there was an agreement that Jordan would annex the West Bank to Jordan. In 1988, there was a separation, and Jordan relinquished all responsibility for the West Bank, and they all recognized, along with the rest of the Arab world, that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people. And the Palestinians want their own state. We don't want the Jordanians to take over responsibility for the West Bank, and we don't want the Egyptians to take over responsibility for Gaza. Nor do the Jordanians or Egyptians want that. Everybody recognizes that the Palestinians want their own independent, sovereign state, and that they have the right to self-determination. That's what we want. Now, whether we want to enter into a federation with Jordan, or a confederation even with Israel, or with Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, or regional arrangements, is today at lunch I was talking about maybe we need regional arrangements after we end the occupation, after you have, equal states, then they can enter freely as equals into all sorts of regional agreements. But until you get rid of the occupation, you cannot think of anything else. And I understand the motive behind your question. You're saying that you want to go back to 67 as political setups. No, we want to go back as territorial lines. The land which Israel occupied in 67.
This is going to have to be the last question, gentleman there. Identify yourself.
My name is Kemal Khalil. I'm with the Palestinian American Bridge. Welcome to Houston.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the Palestinian cause is the core of the Middle East. I do agree with you. But also, you failed to mention that the refugees issue is the core of the Palestinian issue. And I'm not sure where you're going with UN Resolution 194 that gives me personally the right to return. I am from Safed. I need to go back to Safed. I did not sell my land. I was kicked out by force. I don't give Israel the right to my land. I don't give either the PLO or the Palestinian Authority the right to negotiate my own land. So my question is, how do I go back to my own personal land in Safed within that peace process? Thank you.
As you know, the permanent status issues, or the core issues that I talked about, are very well known. Jerusalem, the refugees, boundaries, settlements, security, of course, and then water was added. So the question of refugees is one that must be addressed in negotiations. Now, we said from the beginning that any agreement has to be based on international law and legality, and that you cannot treat the Palestinians as people outside the law, and that the UN resolutions pertaining to the Palestinian question have to be not just recognized but implemented. And the Palestinian refugees cannot be treated as an exception to all the refugees of the world. It's not just Resolution 194, there are protocols pertaining to refugees throughout. And you cannot force a solution on refugees. It's not just the refugees that's the core, it's the land, it's the refugees, it's everybody. The Palestinian question is a composite. And if you want a solution, it has to be a solution that resolves all these issues. You cannot postpone one, you cannot ignore one, you cannot prejudge one. Okay? That's the solution. So the refugees are not only an issue that is needed for Palestine and the right of return recognized, but the question is that the countries around Palestine are all going to be destabilized if the Palestinian refugee question is not solved legally and equitably. So this is not something we ignore. It's not something I discuss separate from all other components. On the contrary, the only way we can have justice for refugees is through a negotiated agreement. But when I talk about negotiations, You negotiate not rights, but implementations of rights.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I know there are about 100 questions out there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's okay. From both. I know.